Kennedy and the Cold War conflicts. This is when we finally get to Vietnam. So just a quick note, I talk about Vietnam here a little bit, but Vietnam is going to be a much bigger thing later. This is just kind of setting the stage a little bit here. And this is a great map to be looking at Vietnam, where it is in the wider world, as well as a lot closer, up close and personal to it. So after World War II, technically France owned Vietnam, but when it comes to the Vietnam War, the United States, having dealt with, the whole triumph of communism in China and then the whole Korean War fiasco, basically the United States views the Vietnam War as, once again, another Cold War conflict. Now, the French are going to have enough and basically end up quitting Vietnam. And Eisenhower, when he was president, really was unwilling to join in a whole nother Asian war when basically the French military position collapsed and he had just, managed to get America out of the Korean War and everything. So he offers a little bit of support, but not very much, really. After 1954, we're going to see the Vietnamese overrun the French in Dien Bien Phu, and we're going to get the Geneva Peace Conference that is going to actually temporarily divide Vietnam into two sections: the communist-controlled northern section and the non-communist southern section. Then they're going to schedule elections for a single Vietnamese government. So when you're looking at the south, you have Ngo Dinh Diem, who is an anti-communist, and he was actually from the South Vietnamese's Roman Catholic elite. Now, the United States is going to be backing him for a time, and they're going to encourage him, hey, put off elections and let's back efforts to actually have a separate and independent South Vietnam. So rather than trying to unify the entire country. So very much learning from lessons from like Korea and everything. Now, if you look at the North, you're going to have Ho Chi Minh, who is going to consolidate the North as a communist state and claims to be the legitimate government really for all of Vietnam. So this brings us back to Kennedy. Kennedy is going to see Vietnam as a chance to really take a firm stance against communism. He felt like Vietnam was an opportunity to reassert like America's commitment to containing communism. But Vietnam and the war there is going to be so much more complicated than just communist North, non-communist South, because you get the Viet Cong, who were basically communist insurgents, but were South Vietnamese individuals. So they support communism, but they live in the South. Diem also makes things even more complicated in South Vietnam itself, because he basically controls the cities with the help of a large army and the Vietnamese elite that had really worked alongside the French. And so we're seeing during this time the United States is stepping up their supply of weapons and advisors, but this aid really isn't working because by 1963, Diem's government is basically losing the loyalty of the people of South Vietnam. And then on top of that, Diem basically almost causes South Vietnam to have a civil war within itself on top of this issue of North and South Vietnam, because Diem is going to violently crush opposition from the Vietnamese Buddhists. And we're going to get some images of that later. At this point, Kennedy's administration is going to tacitly approve a coup of South Vietnam, and this will occur on November 1st, and it will kill Diem as well as his brother and basically install an ineffective military junta or dictatorship. We'll come back to Vietnam later, but this is kind of setting the stage for increased intervention in Vietnam. Which brings us to another Cold War conflict during this time, the Missile Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. In 1962, reconnaissance photos are going to reveal that the Soviet Union actually was working on launching sites in Cuba, and so these nuclear missiles on these sites could potentially hit the United States. So this is going to occur very quickly. It's over the course of 5 days that America will sort out their options. So one option was doing nothing about it. This really wasn't considered. It wasn't really an option because these missiles were a political disaster and they're a huge threat to America's national security. Another option would have been to do a full-scale invasion of Cuba. However, this really wasn't feasible on short notice. A third option was the idea of surgical air strikes, bombing the bombs from above, being really, really specific and technical with it. The problem is this was a technical impossibility at this point in time. So what ends up going forward is this idea of demanding the removal of the missiles and declaring a naval quarantine against any kind of further offensive weapons arriving in Cuba. So basically a blockade. What that means is there's time for diplomacy. And so we're going to see Kennedy imposes this blockade on October 22nd of 1962. This was a Monday, so I want you to feel how fast this goes through. Now, Khrushchev is going to hesitate at that point, and Soviet Union ships are basically going to circle outside of the quarantine line, because to cross over could, mean nuclear annihilation and massive retaliation, everything that we've been looking up into this point. So Khrushchev, on that Friday, will offer to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, but in return the United States had to pledge not to invade Cuba, which is a big deal because remember they've fallen to communism and there's a lot more with Cuba I'm going to get to in a second. Now on Saturday, literally the next day after that, a second communication would be opened up between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union's basically going to complain about the fact that the United States has a bunch of missiles in the territory of their NATO allies over in Europe. So the United States in the end will pledge not to invade Cuba, and they will secretly promise to remove some obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This is going to be accepted on Sunday of October 28th. So why is Cuba an issue? The thing is, Cuba was a problem because the United States really hated the Castro government and feared that it might try to export communist revolutions throughout all of Latin America. There was this concern about the domino effect. If you let one nation fall to communism, it's going to be the first domino in a chain of dominoes that then all these other nations might fall to communism. Also, you have to keep in mind that on the Soviet perspective of things, they were concerned about America trying to invade Cuba and making an issue of Cuba ever since the whole Bay of Pig incident and invasion where the CIA had campaigned to sabotage Cuba on some level. Also, you have to keep in mind there is definitely a strategic imbalance during this time period. The United States really had a lot more missiles aimed at the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union had aimed at the United States. And literally, America had a bunch of missiles, on the doorstep of the Soviet Union over in Europe. But the Soviet missiles in Cuba openly flouted the whole Monroe Doctrine. And it did pose a real military threat in the minds of America, understandably so. And so what we really see here is that both sides are really cautious, and Khrushchev is going to back down rather than try to fight it out because that could lead to nuclear annihilation. Kennedy, on the other hand, is also going to have to fend off advisors who wanted to destroy Cuba. There was a lot of people who wanted America to go in and invade Cuba and really push back communism in that way. And so Kennedy basically does have to compromise by not doing that. Which brings us to another issue of the Cold War at this time, our space race and arms race. Basically, we're seeing the Soviet Union and the United States competing through science and diplomacy. We're seeing with the space race, the Russians are going to send Yuri Gagarin to be the first human to orbit the Earth on April 12th of 1961. However, American John Glenn, pictured here, will match this feat in February of 1962, and that's actually seen in the movie Hidden Figures. I should also mention Katherine Johnson, the woman who did a lot of the calculations for this, actually died in February 24th of 2020. Then we have the arms race dealing with nuclear weapons. We're actually going to see a 3-year memorandum on nuclear weapon development, but then both sides are going to resume after this 3 years mark is over. We see bigger H-bombs being made. You get multiple targetable warheads, anti-ballistic missiles, and all kinds of innovations. But then in July of 1963, the United States, Great Britain, and the USSR are all going to sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Basically, this is going to outlaw, with these 3 nations, nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Now you might be going, well, where else can you test nuclear bombs? The thing is, you could have tested them underground, and the reason that is not included in this treaty is basically the Soviet Union refused on-site inspections, and the United States felt like those were deemed necessary to distinguish the difference between like underground testing from like earthquakes. So that isn't part of the treaty, but the other parts are, and that's a really big deal. They also are going to invite other nations to join in on this treaty. France and China and other nuclear powers, though, are going to refuse to sign this treaty as they're still, trying to play catch up to these 3 nations. It's important to note this treaty really, it doesn't halt weapon development, but it is a really positive achievement and a step towards future disarmament treaties. Compare these kinds of conflicts to today. What is similar about these? What is different to different kinds of conflicts that we see going on across the world or even in a specific part of the world today?